Hello and welcome. If you're just joining us, my name is Bethan Grills and I am the editor of New Food, one of the organisers of Food Integrity and also a global B2B publication. I'd like to give a warm welcome to our next moderator, Charlotte Grant. Charlotte joins us from the World Cocoa Foundation, and she'll be leading this roundtable that aims to explore the issues related to modern slavery and child labour, using the cocoa sector as a case study. Remember that at any point you can pop your questions into that chat box and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bethan. Very happy to be here, and thank you to New Food for organizing this panel discussion on a very important topic today. So I'm joining you from the World Cocoa Foundation. We're a nonprofit and a membership organization. We convene the private sector to tackle issues in the cocoa supply chain, such as poverty, deforestation, and child labor, which is our topic for today. So I'm joined today by an impressive set of panelists. Please help me welcoming Justine Currell. She's the director of Unseen. Troy Pearley is the executive vice president and general manager of Divine Chocolate USA. And Peg Willingham, she's the executive director of Fairtrade America. So welcome to all three of you, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. I'm going to encourage all of our participants today to please share in the discussion. We have a chat box and a question box where you can share some thoughts and ask questions to our panelists. I'll be taking those questions towards the end of the panel. So please do share those, and we'll try and make sure to get to your questions. There's also a poll. If you go into that little tab there, you can see a poll that you can start answering right now. We'll look at the results during our discussion and comment these results. So, child labor and modern slavery, are you doing enough? These topics, they generate a lot of confusion. They're very sensitive, they're very difficult, and they generate a lot of passion, which obviously should be the case. So we thought we'd start our conversation today by looking at the data and looking at a few definitions. So if you want to bear with me a minute, I have just 2 slides for you. Where we'll be going through, what we mean when we talk about, modern slavery, forced labor, and child labor. So when we talk about modern slavery, we talk about traditional practices of forced labor, as well as the new forms of forced labor, such as human trafficking. So forced labor is part of modern slavery. And forced labor means a work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of a penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. When we talk about child labor, we talk about work that deprives children of their childhood and that is harmful to their physical and mental development. So very important notions. In cocoa, since we're going to be focusing about cocoa, dangerous and harmful work could be spraying pesticides, for instance, or using a machete, things like that. And then we talk about work that interferes with the schooling. That's also classified as child labor. So if the child misses 1 day of school because they need to help out their parents in the field, it's going to be classified as child labor as well. So it's a very broad definition. Next slide, please. So now in terms of what the data tells us on the prevalence of these issues around the world. So you can see here in the orange and yellow box, modern slavery and forced labor. So about 40 million people affected by modern slavery worldwide, including about 25 in forced labor. when it comes to child labor, you can see here, unfortunately and very sadly, these huge numbers, 160 million children. That means 1 in 10 children around the world that are affected by child labor. And since we're going to be focusing, on cocoa today, so about 70% of these 160 million children work in agriculture. And amongst these children working in agriculture, for child labor in cocoa, we estimate it's 1.6 million. And these are numbers from, the International Labour Organization and the University of Chicago. So that's it for slides. Let's jump into our discussion. So you can take the slides off. Before I give the floor to our panelists, it's very important to hear from origin and from cocoa farmers. And so we have a very short video that's going to show you what actually goes on in cocoa communities. And there's an interview there with a little girl. And I think it's a really good illustration on what we're talking about when we talk about child labor in cocoa.
Je m'appelle Alina. J'ai 10 ans. Je suis au CP1. Ame ronke. Isa ame point que rona. Ame kada de boro kono. Me wa fukun kana ka shaye me ka mi don kata ka bonne ni korom soni. Kakawa. Ni kakaka do boro la ka gudu.
Nta togo kurubali fo ngolo mais nana ko fi kuro asandi mgwalo tuma do sirani rele ka yirene do ni ka barakanya iba tono soro
Passer sur la personne pour lui dire pardon, comme maintenant le pays a trop changé. Il faut que les enfants soient à l'école. Donc, pardon, il faut laisser ton enfant partir. Mais s'il dit qu'il n'a pas le moyen, on lui dit bon, on a compris, mais c'est nous-mêmes qui pouvons prendre les dépenses pour que les enfants soient tous à l'école.
Nous avons un premier nous avons un luto sokon. Nous avons fait nous columbo. Maintenant, d'autres là, on a que dépenser. On a fait dona bon, il y a wati dola, on a que façon de la belle. Donc, au point de la tamania, mais comme fitin bembouriani. Bon, à l'enfant, comment on fait fou à Delaye. Donc, elle on amena le dou.
Nous, les hommes, même nous qui sommes les grands, on peut s'organiser. Quand vous travaillez en groupe, aujourd'hui c'est mon jour, demain c'est le jour de Sylvain, après demain c'est le jour de Nablé, ainsi de suite. Ça fait que le travail va devant rapidement. On n'a pas besoin de prendre les enfants.
L'école, me fanta le côté takaba, me fanta métier. Parce que ni ka métier à fanakai.
Ne denka be choisi akai parce que ne do make maîtriser o te kalanke ale ire tara do maîtriser do le feke mais ne do te de on kala o beda dagawa.
Thank you, and yes, Alima, we would love for you to become a teacher and teach the next generation in your community. So I'd like to ask the first question to Justine Currell, the director of Unseen. So Justine, your organization is dedicated to fighting modern slavery around the world. I'd love for you to draw for us a picture of the scale of this global issue that we're facing here.
Great, thanks, Charlotte, and good afternoon, everybody. So, yes, modern slavery is a global issue, and it really requires a global solution. We've just heard the estimation of 40 million plus people in modern slavery right now across the globe, and around 160 million children in child labour. But 25% of the world's workforce are in the agricultural sector alone. In just 2 countries, China and India, there are 200 million people employed in this sector. And there are around 225 million people employed in African agriculture, which is about half of the continent's total employment. Now, we as an organisation know that modern slavery is everywhere, but it's most prevalent among communities where there is little opportunity to progress, systems are weak, and poverty is evident. And many of those communities grow and harvest much of the food and the beverages that we consume in the Western world, producing huge quantities of different source products. So, for example, tea, rice and pork from China, where the total estimated number of people in modern slavery is around 3.8 million. Sugarcane, rice and wheat from India, where there are estimated to be a staggering 18 million people in modern slavery. Sugarcane and soybeans from Brazil, with an estimate of 369,000 people in modern slavery. And fish and prawns from Malaysia, where there's an estimate of 212 people in modern slavery. And although those numbers of people in modern slavery I've just given you cover other products, goods and services that the countries produce, like cotton, extractives and electronics, you can see the sheer scale of food production for those countries, and some of the systemic issues they face will undoubtedly mean that there are significant modern slavery and child labour issues within those food production sectors. And we know that modern slavery can be found in source products right the way through commodity supply chains, whole families, including young children, picking and harvesting source products, often in remote villages and towns. The processing and cleaning of those products ready for packaging, the packaging process itself, and then transportation and logistics with large warehouses and distribution centres linking into a network of shops, supermarkets, restaurants and other outlets. Many of these steps have one important element in common: vulnerability. Vulnerability of workers because of their economic situation, many experiencing abject poverty, all wanting to provide for their families. And with a lack of opportunity to improve their situation and the dire need to reap what income there is, often young children, as we've seen on the video, are relied upon to work to help supplement the family's income. This means they lose out on education, where one is even available. But the reality is that most families simply don't have the income needed to put their kids through education and ultimately help break the cycle of poverty. But we have to realise that it's not just happening in locations around Africa and Asia. We see it very clearly here in the UK, as well as across the rest of the EU, the US and Australia. The use of cheap, temporary, seasonal and transient labour across many sectors, including the food sector, enables exploiters to infiltrate supply chains with workers who they abuse and exploit. Many will have few rights or not know their rights and may not be able to speak the local language, or may have no other viable alternative. And the lack of transparency down supply chains and inadequate due diligence processes means that these types of modern slavery practices can really go on unnoticed because they're so far removed from the eyes who make the decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine, for this overview. Peg, I'd like to hand it over to you. So, as Fairtrade, you have a good view of, the commodities that and the basic ingredients that we use, in some of our favorite products. So why is this happening in commodity supply chains?
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you to everybody who is participating or watching later. Thank you for being committed to integrity in food, including on this important issue. And the reason that we're seeing child labor in commodities such as cocoa or coffee is, as other speakers said, it's because that's where agriculture is 70% of child labor. It is the vast majority of economic activity in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Caribbean. and your cocoa and coffee are being grown on small family farms. And my mother grew up on a farm in the UK, and she did help around the farm. So did her 6 brothers and sisters, but they also went to school. They were not expected to do the things we're talking about today. Other speakers have mentioned on cocoa farms, children using machetes to cut down the cocoa pods, carrying heavy loads, working with pesticides and so forth. Now, their parents, and it is, again, family farms, parents want their children to get educated. You just saw this in the video where Halima's father is glad about the child going to school. But poverty is the underlying driver. And this has actually been made worse, unfortunately, by COVID. When migrant labor was shut down because of travel bans, schools were closed, so parents had to take their children to the fields. Of course, poverty got worse, or if parents became ill. So unfortunately, the problem has gotten worse due to COVID. Now, we are proud to partner with companies like Divine, and you'll be hearing from Troy. It is a problem that can be tackled, and I'll talk later about how Fairtrade works on this. But again, the reality is agriculture is the #1 activity. Family farms are the primary kind of farm you'll see in developing countries, and children are working with their parents on these farms, often in conditions that are inappropriate for their age. Thank you.
Thanks, Peg. So let's get to Troy and zooming in on, the chocolate company. So Troy, your company is co-owned by cocoa farmers in a cocoa farming community. So how do you approach these issues of child labor and forced labor?
First of all, good afternoon, my fellow folks on the panel, and to everyone watching and engaging in such a meaningful dialogue and discussions right now. Divine Chocolate is co-owned by Ghanaian farmers. The cooperative is named Coapa Cocoa. There's 100,000 smallholder farmers. They own 20% of the company, so they share 20% of the profits. They make 40% of the decisions on the board. So our model is the ownership model. We're a fair trade brand, so we provide stable pricing. Because as you know, commodities pricings go up and down. With us being a fair trade brand, we're proud to say that we're able to provide stable pricing to the farmers that we do business with, our owners. So the ownership model is how we feel that we can address this, because everyone that spoke, my fellow panelists, we know that poverty is the root cause or a major cause why we have these problems. We invest in the communities that we work in with producer support and development programs. One of the key programs that we've worked for years with is the literacy program. We found that almost 80% of the women in Ghana are illiterate or close to illiterate. We found the literacy program to yield very positive results, and just in terms of how they approach work, how they approach managing their families. I've had the opportunity to speak to several women that have completed the program, and their kids have gone on to do things in the fields of computer law and things of that nature. One mom even mentioned to me that the program was so successful that she was able to explain to her daughter that it was great to be a mom, but you don't have to be a young mom. You have options. So, we take a different approach. We try to engage with the farmers, but equally as important, there's things that Coapa addresses simply is just providing school supplies and pencils and books for students. Their head is not in the sand. There's a child labor monitoring system in place. Over 40 communities this past year with COVID were able to see on a monthly basis videos that, speaking about the negatives with child labor and actions that we should take. There's watchdog groups with 600 plus farmers that's monitoring the villages and the communities to stay on top of these type of things, to communicate if they see problems. Radio is still a big medium in Ghana. So, there's over 11 FM stations where Coapa runs jingles and commercials against child labor, which I think is pretty good because not only are the farming communities hearing these videos, non-farming communities are hearing these videos. So the indigenous people are able to understand how cooperative views work in children and things of that nature. That we also print up materials that go out through the various communities. Over 30,000 posters have been printed up this past year, talking about the evils of child labor. So it's a proactive approach. Divine Chocolate takes an engagement approach with our owners, and we keep open communication with them, and they reach out to the indigenous people along with the members of the cooperative to speak about child labor and not sticking their head in the sand, and making sure that that people within the community know that it's wrong for children to be working on farms.
Thank you, Troy. I'm going to follow up and playing a bit of a devil's advocate role here. Justine, painted a very bleak picture for us, and we can see that these issues are very prevalent all around the world, including in developed countries. When we talk about cocoa communities, obviously these are very poor countries with issues around infrastructure, around poverty that is prevalent throughout the country. So do you think it's realistic that to think we can eliminate child labor and forced labor from cocoa?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it can be. It's a matter of us just engaging with the right stakeholders and holding everyone accountable. I mean, we send people to the moon. I mean, absolutely, this can be addressed and fixed, between the NGOs, the government, the cooperatives. And the one thing that Coopera does that I'm really, really impressed with, the folks that they work with are doing programs with them. So their products are sold in Lido, which is a global retailer, and they're working on child labor projects with them. So it's just a matter of you partnering with your trade partners and demanding them to help solve problems. So I'm definitely confident. I think the future is bright. The more we talk about it, and the more we engage with the proper stakeholders, we absolutely can fix this.
Thanks. Justine, do you want to follow up on that?
Oh, I just totally agree. I love, Troy saying that, we can put people on the moon, but we can't deal with some of these systemic issues. And I think, that's absolutely true. I think it's making sure that we can, look at everything that we do, how far removed we are from the source product. I think, for too long, we've put this in the too difficult to manage box. Because it is systemic and because it is complex. But Troy's absolutely right. We need those kind of multilateral conversations. We need the right stakeholders around the table, and we need a real willingness from everybody involved to make sure that, we can give every child an education and a good diet, and every family an opportunity, to kind of continue to progress. So I think it is doable, but it will be difficult, it will be complex, it will be long, but it's not unachievable.
Thanks. Peg, on your side, so we see these claims, 100% slavery-free, child labor-free products. As a certifier, I mean, is that possible to achieve, and is that possible to guarantee?
So unfortunately, it is not possible to guarantee that anything is 100% free of child labor, unfortunately. And as a certifier, we cannot be on every farm every day. So that is the challenge. I will say, to build on what the others just said, I do think it's a problem that can be solved because the numbers have come down dramatically in the last few decades as poverty has decreased. But unfortunately, as we've seen, there has been a bump up in the last few years, but the overall trend is, gives us reason to be encouraged. But in terms of these claims around 100% free and how that's not really feasible, I will say that the fair trade system, and the name sort of tells you what we do, we're trying to have fair prices, fair conditions for the farmers who grow the vast majority of the coffee, the cocoa, bananas, and so forth that we consume in wealthier countries. We have child labor as part of our rigorous international standards. And so a farm cannot be certified until they've met those standards. And farmers will go to a lot of work to get certified. It's a community-based approach, and it is involving the farmers. We saw in the video about Halima and her community that it wasn't just coming in and saying, you're bad. It's working with the community to do the education. Now, if somebody just doesn't make progress, then we could decertify them. But on the more positive side, how we address it is through the education. We have regular audits first to get certified, and then regularly we can have unannounced audits. If we receive complaints, we will address those as well, and they can come from, happen during an audit or can come from another source. But it's trying to help, children can help on the farm, but under these strict conditions, and, age appropriate, not dangerous, outside of work hours and so forth. So these are the things that we do to sort of say, can't be 100%, but there is a lot that we can do to really address the problem. And of course, poverty, as everybody has said, is a big issue, hard to tackle, but progress has been made in the last 20, 30 years. Thanks.
Thanks, Peg, and thanks for highlighting that very important distinction between child labor and child work. I'm sure some people on the line have been on farms or grew up on farms, and obviously it's quite usual for children to help out, and not everything is classified as child labor. Child labor is really what harms the child and gets in the way of their schooling, and some of the child work is acceptable and even desirable for the future of these children. So what about you, Troya Divine? Do you have that guarantee of 100% slavery-free, child labor-free chocolate?
We don't make that claim on any of our packages or any of our messaging in terms of the brand, but I can 100% guarantee that Kawapa Coco's monitoring this and that there's systems in place to avoid the worst happening. We have people in the field, not only the cooperative officers, but there's farmers, for lack of a better term, that's almost like a watchdog group that just keeps their eye on the working conditions. Being a fair trade brand with the audits, as Peg mentioned, is important just to keep the farms managing properly. And then there's, child labor monthly videos that shared in the community. So I can 100% with a high degree of confidence say that it's being discussed and the membership knows that it's wrong. But let's not victimize the victim also, because there's a lack of infrastructure in origin. So for example, someplace, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and for me to get to Long Island, New York, it may be an hour-and-a-half trip. In parts of Ghana, that same hour-and-a-half trip is 5 hours because of lack of infrastructure. When my wife and I decided to have children and we went to the school and we registered our kids, the first question they asked is, will you be needing bus service? So they're not afforded these options like we're afforded. That's why I'm always big on the stakeholders have to get engaged and work in the communities where they're sourcing their commodities from to help these farmers.
Yeah, thank you. No, very good point. I once visited a cocoa farm, and the children had to walk 1 hour to go to school. So they told me, they'll do it on the Monday, they'll do it on the Tuesday, maybe on the Wednesday they'll stay on the farm because it's just very difficult to get to the school. Yeah, thanks for making that point. Justine, do you want to jump in on that issue of 100% slavery-free claims?
I think other than what the other panelists have already said, I think you can never guarantee, and we never should, because I think that would mean that people would think that it's an issue that we don't need to focus on anymore. So I'm always nervous to try and make those assumptions. We spend a lot of time working with global businesses to try and get them to think about the decisions that they make and the impact that that has right down the supply chain. And I think we need to maintain that focus. I think it's great that we have initiatives that seek to, eradicate, eliminate, whatever way in which we want to try and tackle this. But I do think we should always be cognizant of the fact that we're talking about systemic issues. In some respects, we're talking about criminal activity when you look at what's happening, in places like the UK with people wanting to infiltrate supply chains as well. So we just need to be alive to the risk, and we need to not take our eye off the ball.
Yeah, thanks. So you've heard Troy and Peg share on some of the solutions and some of the activities that they put in place in their respective organizations to fight child labor. So, in your view, and this is, the question at the center of this panel, are companies, and more specifically the food sector, doing enough? And, what more could they do?
So I think, simplest answer is no. We could always do more. I think there are great pockets of good practice, but right across, the food networks and the supply chains, there just simply isn't enough. I think globalization and long, complex supply chains means that it is tough often to know what's happening at source. But that can't be an excuse for us to bury our heads in the sand and hope that this issue will go away. And there are other good examples that we could draw on. I know that Nestlé's Income Accelerator program that aims to get a real living income to encourage and support farmers that take the risk and cost of new approaches to farming has just been launched. And that programme focuses specifically on the root causes of child labour and looking at the living income gap that farmers and their families face and working with communities to improve the situation. But I think, like with everybody else here, it's recognised that the path to a living income, again, will be long and complex, and it's very much reliant on strong partnerships with the government and the farmers themselves. But I go back to what we mentioned earlier. We do need multilateral activity with a focus on investing in communities. As we saw in the video that was played, communities promoting the value of providing an education to children and helping families to pay for their child's education, which is critical, because this is one of the reasons why children are not going to school. It's not for the lack of the families wanting to send their children to school. It's a necessity for them to work. So if we could remove that barrier, that would be amazing. Easy to say, extremely difficult to do, I know. But I think we still need to be alive to the situation and the fact that there are far too many people happily benefiting from the exploitation of others. And as businesses, we make decisions every day about our profit margins, who we do business with, how socially responsible we want to be. And all of these decisions will have implications for those further down the supply chain. And I think, bringing out the fact that if we want to take the right approach and we want to place the needs of workers at the heart of what we do, it can have many benefits for companies. We can improve reputation and really build a brand. We can increase profits. It doesn't cost a lot to do the right thing. And I think that's one of the key messages that we really need to get across. It attracts further investment, and it also supports talent acquisition. So we see so many more, younger people, Gen Zs, millennials, who are coming through and wanting to work with companies who put the ESG agenda at the heart of what they do. And finally, all I would say on the ESG agenda, which a lot of businesses are focusing on at the moment, the social element of that is exactly what we're talking about today. It's not just about general inclusion. It's not just about gender equality. It's also about doing the right thing so that your workers, the people that you employ, whether that's directly or indirectly, are treated fairly, appropriately, paid the right living wage, and then we can start to look at how we can really look to eradicate this. You know, this will take a lifetime. This is not an issue that will go away overnight. And I think it needs concerted effort from all of us involved.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Justine. I think she's spot on. As Divine Chocolate, as us being a social enterprise and a B Corp, we're mindful of the suppliers that we work with and, you know, the customers that we trade with. It's going to just takes a concerted effort. You know, I'm pleased to be able to sit on a panel like this and have this type of discussion. But we need to have people, companies taking more of a proactive approach and engaging with these commodity farmers to come up with some sustainable solutions moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Troy. Actually, I wanted to ask you, you know, so we've seen that, you know, child labor is extremely prevalent in cocoa communities. So concretely, can you walk us through what people do at Divine when you encounter instances of child labor in your supply chain?
Well, there's a child labor monitoring system that Co-op has implemented with child protection committees. So also with a call center. So once that's identified, it's an immediate investigation. Even Fairtrade will be called in just to investigate it to make sure that that's not occurring, or if it's occurring, it's stopped immediately. And it's a data collection review also, so that it's noted and it's being able to be monitored, and some resolution can, you know, take place. So that's the broad answer. But, you know, I'm sure that there's it's not that black and white. I'm sure that it's more messier than that. But I know from speaking to the officers at Co-op or Cocoa, that's nothing that they, you know, play with. That's something they don't want to be associated with at all. So I know it's immediate attention, is, you know, it's code red, God forbid, if that's occurring.
Thanks. And what about Fairtrade? You know, when you conduct inspections and you encounter child labor, what's your policy?
Well, we take allegations of child labor very seriously. So when an allegation is made, it does trigger Fairtrade International's protection policy for children and vulnerable people or vulnerable adults. And this policy requires us to act safely to protect the impacted persons and support also the farmer cooperatives with prevention measures and remediation. So the first thing we would do is do a quick, you know, immediately address with a follow-up assessment. And we would also, if this is confirmed, we would then report it to national child protection agencies and support any independent follow-up. We report it to our auditing arm, which is called FlowCert, which is independent from us. And our standards require remediation whenever this does happen, including the safety of the child, that the child is not withdrawn only to have other children substituted for them, and that the kind of prevention and education projects are put in place that we saw again in the video. That was a UNICEF video, but those are the same kind of approaches we have and that Troy discussed with Divine. And I can also tell you that it really does happen, because I received an email several weeks ago from a US-based NGO contacting me for Fairtrade America as a US arm of this whole international system, saying, you know, we have received a credible report, we think, from a farm in West Africa. So I connected them with the right people in Fairtrade International, and I know they've taken it forward. I was copied on some of the emails before it, you know, moved to a more sensitive and confidential stage. So even though it's too bad there was an allegation, in a way, I'm happy that I can tell you very much firsthand that these things are immediately addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Audience members, this is your last call to participate in a poll. So you've got that poll up in the box at the side of your screen there. So the question is, what do you view as the main concern in your specific sector or supply chain? A, poor working practices. So that's, for instance, long hours, insufficient breaks, things like that. B, child labor. C, forced labor, and we've seen those definitions at the top. D, none of the above. So Bethan, can you give us the result of the poll, or do people need a few more seconds to complete these?
Yeah, I mean, I think let's give them another sort of minute. So dive into a few questions, and I'll interject after that with the results.
Fantastic, thank you. And keep those questions coming. I know we have at least 2 or 3 questions lined up when we get to our Q&A with the audience in a few minutes. So before we get to that, I'd like to talk about the role of governments and the public sector. So let's talk about governments in consumer countries first. Obviously, the European Union has made headlines this month with announcing a due diligence legislative proposal, and very interesting development that might be a game changer. So I'd love to turn it over to Justine for your input on what's the role of consumer countries in these types of legislation.
Great, thanks, Charlotte. Well, having been involved in drafting the Modern Slavery Act here in the UK, I do think legislation can be an effective tool, but I think it can also be a blunt instrument, as we have seen in the UK. 5-6 years on from the Act being enacted, we are still seeing, several thousand businesses not complying with Section 54 around transparency and supply chains, which is pretty horrendous in itself, given that we're talking about some of the biggest countries that have a footprint in the UK. So I do think we need a multi-pronged approach. I think we need legislation that makes it very clear what the penalty is for non-compliance. And we need an approach that's focused on continuous improvement and not just the element of compliance, because for me, it's very much around a change of behaviour. And we need to move away from the tick box exercise. The moment we put a list of questions asking, have you done X, Y, and Z, then, the natural reaction is just to say, yes, I've done X, Y, and Z, but not really putting any thought into it. And we've seen the same principle with the modern slavery statements, the annual modern slavery statements that businesses need to complete in the UK. A flurry of activity 2 months before the statement goes out, and not much underpinning that statement, and not much work happening within the business. So for me, I would like to see in the UK something similar to the Tariff Act, which is in the US, because I think it can be effective in strangling the ability of big companies who don't apply appropriate due diligence to stop trading. Obviously, there's a downside to that, because if we're preventing goods and products from coming into countries, then it does have a knock-on effect to those on the ground who are maybe relying on the payment from those big companies. But I think we do need to take this seriously. And I think governments have a very specific role to play, not only negotiating and working with embassies and governments elsewhere and trying to improve the situation through those kind of multilateral conversations. But, we have, in the UK, we have a government that spends billions of pounds on public contracts that have supply chains right across the world. And yet we are still seeing situations, like in COVID, the fact that PPE, the equipment, was being sourced from countries where there is known issues around forced labour and child labour, despite the fact that the government is saying that it is checking and testing and applying appropriate due diligence to all of its contracts. So we know that nobody's immune from the issue of modern slavery. We know that if you have legislation, it's an effective framework. What we need to do now is make sure that the international community can come together. We have, the Vigilante Bill in France, which has been out for some years. We now have modern slavery legislation in Australia. Canada's looking at this, New Zealand, other places across the EU, aside from the fact that we have the mandatory human rights and due diligence directive, in the offing within the EU. So I think it's really important that we look at all of that in the round, that we do find a common theme across all of the legislation to make it easier for businesses not only to comply, but to continuously improve, to seek that continuous improvement. And I think if we make it easier for businesses to comply with the legislation, then it might be more beneficial to everybody involved, because businesses will see a way forward and not feel like they're being kind of wrapped up in lots of different legislation that's going to hinder their operations. So I do think that's really important. I think the other thing I would mention is just around, kind of what else governments could do. And I think, looking at ways in which we can introduce technology to really help those on the ground become more sustainable. Thinking about, for example, crop diversification, so that if you have a failed crop, it's not an abysmal situation for the farmer, that actually there are alternatives in terms of keeping that income coming in. So thinking about all of these different alternatives, supporting people to become more sustainable, utilizing technology to do that, and making sure that we can grow sustainable communities that really can benefit from the expertise and experience of those on the ground. We don't have all of the answers. And I think it's also recognizing that as well. There's not just one size fits all.
Thanks, Justine. You mentioned the Tariff Act in the US. I wanted to ask Troy about that, because we regularly hear that, Customs and Border Protection, might seize cocoa shipments, that because they suspect that sometimes cocoa might be linked to forced labor. Troy, what do you think about that, and how would that affect the cocoa farmers that you work with?
I mean, every time CBP holds a container, it's just disastrous. You're hurting the farmers. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's almost like you're punishing the victims. I think Justine is spot on when she speaks of the stakeholders in various, parts pulling together to monitor this process, to have a better transparency in this whole supply chain in general. But I mean, anytime a container is held by customs, it's disastrous to say the least.
All right, thank you.
I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have the poll results ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So a bit of a landslide here. So we asked, what do you view as the main concern in your specific sector or supply chain? And 64% said poor working practice, 18% said none of the above, and then joint in 9% said child labour and forced labour.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Peg, do you want to react, or any other of the panelists? Do you want to react to those results?
I would just say I hope that you really know what's happening in your supply chain, because this is not just cocoa, it's coffee. It's happening all over the world. Unfortunately, so you've seen 160 million children, and about 70% of them are in agriculture. So this is a food conference. So I do applaud your companies, and you're here because you are committed to integrity, but it may be that you don't have transparency all the way from farm to the shelf here in consumer countries. And then I'll let others respond, and then I'll just very quickly say something about US policy, and I know we want to get to the question.
Yeah,
so I'm going to answer really fast.
I want to get to you on that. Yeah. Justine and Troy, did you want to weigh in on the poll results? Or shall we keep going?
For me, it highlights the fact that there's no, we saw the definitions, you put the definitions up, Charlotte, but I think that kind of understanding of, what's poor practice, when does it tip into forced labour? And we have these discussions and conversations all the time. But I absolutely agree with Peg. I think, it is the lack of, for me, the lack of transparency, which I think is the key issue. And I think I work with many businesses, both here in the UK and internationally, and there's always that element of slight disbelief that it could be happening within the supply chains of a particular business. But I think it's also because many businesses are making assumptions based on what they're asking suppliers, and it goes just as far as that. A supply questionnaire that is handed out to all suppliers, we make an assumption based on what the supplier is telling us, and we're doing nothing more to confirm or deny those assertions. So I think, for me, it's really around leadership and governance within businesses. It's around communicating. It's around making sure that the right awareness raising and training is in place. And then it's about applying the appropriate risk management mitigation strategies. And then ultimately, as you heard from Peg and Troy, really knowing and understanding what you do if you suspect there is an issue within your supply chain, because that's absolutely crucial. And that's the area where businesses find the most difficulty.
Thank you. Peg, did you want to weigh in on the US policy side of things?
Sure. And I'll just say for our audience, it may be that your role in your company, you don't work on supply chain. So maybe that's why, we're not trying to accuse you all of not giving accurate answers, but it's just to say it is a prevalent problem and everybody can play a part. So in terms of what governments can do, the US Department of Labor does have an International Labor Affairs Bureau with a focus on child labor and trafficking. So they do training of labor inspectors, of law enforcement, of the children themselves, of teachers, of parents. They spend quite a bit of money on these programs. They do reports, though, that also can be used by companies like yours to assess risks in their supply chain. So there is information out there to help companies make decisions about what they should be looking for. And I know we're going to be getting to the questions in the chat, but people are asking, what can they do? Look for the information if you're a company. If you're a consumer, look behind what's, the claims that are being made, do some research, and demand more information. Thanks.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in the end. So what about governments in origin countries? I wonder, Troy, if you could say a few words about how your company works with the government in Ghana.
I mean, so with Cocoa Bar, of course, they trade with them to sell the cocoa from the membership of Coapa Cocoa. They also utilize their workshops that provide better farming techniques, information on fertilization, pesticides, and things of that nature. So it's twofold. They trade with them, they sell the cocoa, and when workshops are available, they participate in those workshops for better farming techniques and things that can long-term improve the farming system and with their membership.
Thank you. Peg and Justine, do you want to say a few words about origin countries and what can be done in origin in terms of, government role and legislative initiatives in origin?
Justine?
Well, I mean, I think, some of it's already been said. I think, that firstly, for governments to understand that there are options to take here. Like I said, legislation's not always the answer, but it is helpful, to kind of improve situations for workers in origin countries. But as we mentioned earlier, taking that kind of understanding of all stakeholders need to be involved around the table. Governments need help and support, from the rest of the world to actually look at these systemic issues and help put in an infrastructure, as we heard from Troy earlier, that will mean that even though, it's no good having a child with a place at school if it takes an hour and a half for that child to get to school, because as you said, you kind of fall back into, well, it's easier to actually work for the family than it is to go and go to school every day. So it's the infrastructure, I think, that's really lacking. And once we've got the infrastructure in place, then everything else will start to fall into place, hopefully, and we'll see more kids out of poverty and into education and with a better future in front of them.
I would just agree with all of the above. Yeah.
Thanks. So let's get to some of our audience questions. So we have an excellent question from Anita. And Justine, you touched on this earlier, but anyone can jump in on that one. What role do you see technology playing to ensure ethical supply chains?
Well, I mean, that can be several-fold. So obviously technology to support on the ground and the infrastructure, I think, is really key. But there are initiatives that are, out there at the moment where they are, using technology to follow the money down supply chains, for example, to make sure that there's no illegal subcontracting. And there are other opportunities to look at, kind of heat maps in terms of, other issues that will be affecting, the situation around forced labour and child labour. I mean, the most pertinent issue at the moment is clearly what we're seeing in the Ukraine, and the fact that when people are displaced, when, there's a lack of housing, when there's a lack of opportunity, when there's social unrest, war, that can all create an environment where people are much more easily exploited because they become extremely vulnerable. And I think, we just need to be cognizant of the fact that things can change in a moment, and we need to ensure that we've got the technology where possible that we can deploy in these countries to really support on the ground activities, but then also to support businesses who are making decisions every day about their business and their operations, and to ensure that there is a comprehensive framework that allows businesses to understand more about what's happening on the ground. As I said, there are a number of initiatives that are out. One of the key ones I've seen is really where we're focusing on following the money. So knowing that, so we know these types of initiatives are possible.
Thanks. There was also a definition question that maybe you can answer quickly. Is labor in prisons, in jail, is it considered forced labor?
Yeah, well, I think that depends on who you ask.
All right.
But yes, I mean, there's a major issue, particularly in a number of countries where, there are, conscriptions, prison, and they are all very significant because they are high harm, and they are basically abusing and exploiting those individuals. And you need to look at the wider conditions in terms of, kind of how that would be perceived as forced labour or not. I think sometimes it's termed hard labour, and it's penance for having committed a crime. But unfortunately, I think this is the kind of issue with what happens and is acceptable in one country is completely different in another country. So we're always needing to understand that wider context in order to to kind of assess that issue. So I think the labeling of things sometimes is unhelpful.
Thank you. We've just 2 minutes left, and there's an excellent question here that was actually going to be my closing question to the panel. So I don't know who suggested that question, but it says, what does the panel suggest we as consumers can do to increase pressure on manufacturers to end child and forced labor in food and beverage, beyond the power of our wallet and purchasing brands like Divine Chocolate? And the question I had for you, and you can choose, which way you want to go, is, what can audience members do today to tackle modern slavery and child labor in their supply chains. So Troy, do you want to go first since you've been mentioned in that question here?
Well, of course, I'm going to encourage everybody to join the chocolate revolution and purchase Divine chocolate because it directly has a positive effect on the farmers of Kawapa cocoa. But just be mindful in general, what you're purchasing, and just read labels, ask questions, challenge your Congress people, your local lawmakers, and hold everyone accountable and get engaged. This is something that that can't be fixed alone by the Divine chocolate. We need all of the audience members and panel members and their colleagues to get engaged to help solve this problem.
Peg, your turn.
I would just agree, examine the claims, be educated, make demands on the brands that you like that aren't doing something. And consumer research shows that shoppers want to make ethical purchases. So you'd be doing something that is also smart for your business as well as the right thing to do.
Thank you. Justine, what can our audience members do today?
Well, I think it's about asking questions as much as the kind of purchasing power is asking pertinent questions, because, businesses have a legal requirement to comply with legislation, and the legislation is increasing over time. So we want to call out businesses that are not doing enough or are making, sometimes very bland statements about the activities that they're undertaking. This is going to take a concerted effort. And yes, it is very difficult to identify ethical brands sometimes. It's very difficult, and we are making, we sit here and we can probably afford to, look at all of the different goods and services that we take. Some people don't have the luxury and don't have the money, to make the consumer choices that we would prefer. But I think we need to recognize that, and we need businesses who, are at the top of the supply chain, who are, have that direct involvement with consumers, that they have a responsibility, to be transparent, and we have a responsibility to ask the right questions, and where we can make those decisions by choosing products that we think are more ethical.
Thank you, Justine. Thank you, Troy, and thank you, Peg. It's been a great pleasure to join you in this panel, and thank you to New Food for asking these important questions and organizing this event. Over to you, Beth.
Oh, thank you, Charlotte. No, back at you all. You're doing such amazing work. So thank you all for discussing this extremely important topic and offering some really helpful insight there and best practice on moving towards a system whereby modern slavery and child labour does not exist. And as Troy rightly said, and is definitely my favourite quote of today, we can fly people to the moon. Fixing this issue should not be impossible. It just takes effort. So well said, Troy. And yeah, amazing panel. So thank you so much. You can join Peg and I in about just over 10 minutes for an intimate networking session. So feel free to pop your camera on. If you're a bit camera shy, just ask questions via audio or via the chat. That's absolutely fine. We'll be exploring some of the questions you posed in more detail there. And if I don't see you for that session, I just want to extend a big thanks to all our speakers so far. It has been a wonderful start to food integrity, and we have so much more to come. Tomorrow, my colleague Joshua Minchin will be looking after you as we delve deeper into the topic of food safety, and I'll be making an appearance as the moderator, so keep your eyes peeled. Then I'll be back as your host on Wednesday for our technology focus day. On Thursday, you can join us for a day of health and nutrition, and Friday we'll be discussing sustainability as we edge nearer to that target of net zero emissions. It has been a delight to be your host again for Food Integrity. And I urge you all, I have to do a plug. If you haven't already, find New Food online at www.newfoodmagazine.com. We publish daily news and articles. We have a podcast and, of course, our esteemed publication, which you can subscribe to for free. Troy actually wrote us an article, so you can read some bits and pieces from him as well. Finally, a big shout out to our sponsors. Do go check out their virtual booths and demos. There's some fantastic solutions showcased. Thanks all. Thank you again, panel. You are wonderful. Hope to see you at that networking session. Goodbye.
Cheers.